Hey, so hi everyone tuning in from YouTube and from the stream. Today we're asking questions to Dr. Larry McMahan, who has experience in quantum physics, computer science, machine learning, a lot of other cool stuff. And he'll be talking about his research and his experience. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. And then we have some pre-submitted questions as well that we'll be asking along the way. But we can start with me and Rishit. We had a couple of questions for ourselves. So we wanted to start off by talking about like just your like entire experience in general. Like you could starting from high school maybe. Like you could start with like your undergraduate research or your undergraduate learning and your graduate school learning and just like how in general and what things you did and where you went.
Okay, was that directed at me?
Oh yeah, we started the
Okay,
event. So
okay. So I went to high school in Temple, Texas, and they were a fairly good school for getting you prepared for college. And that got me into Rice University. Um, and Rice University is probably one of the top 5 or 6 colleges in the US. Um, and they're a very good place to go to for science or engineering. And I started out, I wound up going as a physics major. Uh, and my first year, I did well in my math class, which was a calculus class. And so I was invited into the honors math program. And I didn't want to drop physics, so I wound up becoming a double major in physics and math. Um, and that was my undergraduate degree. I could not find any, at that time, there was not a lot of opportunities for internships in physics. And the only math internship was at an insurance company doing actuary. And that did not appeal to me. So at that time, I had been taking some computer science courses as an undergraduate for fun. This was a time when they were offering courses for people, for the kids to suggest courses in various areas, find a faculty member who was willing to teach it. And so I found some game playing courses, and I found a operating systems course. And I took those, and I was really liked that. And so I wound up switching fields from math and physics to computer science between my undergrad year and my graduate school. And after that, I did my primary graduate work in computer architecture design. And I wanted to design an architecture that would directly execute languages. And most of the direct execution stuff up until that point had been aimed at a particular language. But I wanted one that would operate with any of the major languages. So I picked about 5 or 6 languages, broke them down into the primitives, and designed an architecture that was used for that. At that time, there was most of the research in that area was for machines that directly executed, but at the same time, a company at HP had started inventing a different architecture called RISC, which was reduced instruction set computing. And the idea was to break the instructions down into their most basic fundamental parts so that you could run the clock faster on the processor and do more instructions. And at that time, when I graduated in 75, but due to personal issues, namely the lady that I wanted to marry was becoming a grad student at Columbia University. I moved to New York City, and I worked in the data processing department for a hospital there for 5 years until she got her degree. We both moved out here to Northern Bay Area, Northern California Bay Area, and I found a job at a startup that was trying to build a new computer system that would be more fault tolerant. This was a thing called Trilogy. And he was going to, the guy who designed this was named Gene Amdahl. And Amdahl had previously built IBM clones so that you could buy a computer that was close to what a IBM machine would do, but for much less price, because the IBM machines were very highly priced at the time because they were the only high-powered machines that were available at that time. And this is the early 70s and the middle 70s. And we ran into some problems. So this was a startup. We ran into some problems with the physical layout of the machine. And basically the company went bankrupt. My boss had gone to Hewlett-Packard, and I got hired at Hewlett-Packard to do the operating system integration for their new CISC design, or for their new RISC design. And the new RISC design that they did the operating system for, they first did a proprietary operating system called MPE, which is Multiprocessing Executive, and then they ported Berkeley Unix to the new machine and created an operating system called HPUX, which is HP Unix. I worked for HP for 25 years. The first 5 years was getting the HP Unix system out the door. I worked for a couple of years in their computer lab, and then I moved to HP's architecture lab. And at that lab, I did mostly firmware architecture and how you marry the hardware to the software that you're writing, and what you provide in terms of, there's something that you guys are probably familiar with called BIOS. BIOS is a layer that sits in between the hardware and the operating system software. But in the current computers, the BIOS, or most of the current computers, the BIOS only runs during setup and then gives complete control to the operating system after startup. The HP computers weren't designed this way. We designed our firmware to provide libraries that the operating system could call to achieve goals that you couldn't get just with the hardware alone. So you would write a firmware library routine that would be something that the operating system would want to do in hardware, but there weren't hardware capabilities for it. So the firmware would do the things in hardware that was necessary and return the right values to the operating system. So my job there was to define the firmware calls that would be used to support the operating system, and to work with the hardware and operating system and firmware developers to make sure all of that stuff worked right. And I did that probably for another 15 years or so. So I've been at HP for 20 years now. And at that point, we bought a company called Tandem Computing. And Tandem Computing was a fail-safe, non-stop operating system that ran on their machines. And we had just built some new processors that were next generation processors. And so we decided to we bought Tandem because they were beginning to run low on cash. And I went to the Tandem division for HP, and the objective there was to put that operating system onto the HP processors. And I did that for about 5 years before I retired. And then after I retired, I did some startup work doing various web applications until I was invited to teach at ASDRP and Fremont STEM. And so I've been teaching AP high school students subjects for Fremont STEM, and I have been doing research advising in the areas of both computer science, quantum physics, quantum computing, machine learning, and now I'm doing a little bit of work combining machine learning and robotics with autonomous vehicles. So that is my history in what, 10 minutes or less.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Out of your whole story, the one thing I found like really different is your work in the HP lab. Because like I know when most of us think about working in labs, we think of like test tubes and chemicals, but not really like the tech side of things. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain how working in the HP lab like really works. Like, is there a certain procedure you had to go through, or like how is the safety in there and everything? Like, could you kind of just give us a breakdown of how the HP lab works?
Okay, so it's not like a chemistry lab. It's not a wet lab. It's an electronics lab. And so a lot of the things that you do, you wind up designing circuits, designing designing massive scale integrated chips, and then figuring out how to put those chips on a board. So it's a lab where a lot of soldering is done, where you get chips from your fab, you put those on a printed circuit board, you design the printed circuit board to get the leads from the right source to the right destination, and then you try to bring that up and run it as a computer. Does that give you an idea, Rashid, about what we're trying to do?
Yeah, it does for sure.
Yeah, so talking about like researching, especially in like the computer science and computing field and all that engineering stuff, we looked at your profile too before the event, and we saw that you research game development as well and game theory. So can you like run us through how exactly that works? Because we know that like game development's like coding and getting games developed, but how exactly do you do research in that field?
Okay, there is okay, how do I say this? Game playing and game theory are only tangentially related. Game theory is used in a practical way to teach a gamer how to run a game or to make the game smarter. But game theory can also be used in a wide variety of applications where you're trying to optimize an outcome. Because after all, when you're playing a game, you're trying to optimize an outcome, right? You want to win. And winning is optimizing your chances in playing that game. Game theory is a lot about setting up scenarios where you're trying to optimize a certain thing being done. See if I can think of an example. For example, you could use game theory and machine learning combined together to let's take the autonomous vehicle example. If the vehicle takes records of success or failure based on its operation, it's trying to manage its way through a course without running into, without falling off the edge of a cliff, or without running into something on the side, or without running a stoplight or something like that. So every time it does something correct, it gets positive reinforcement, and every time it does something incorrect, it gets negative reinforcement. And all of these gets added up in such a way that the next time the vehicle sees where it's asked to go, it's going to use those past experiences to tell it which way to turn, when to stop, and when to go. So that's all optimizing its course using game theoretic optimizations. That's very much like what a game player does when he plays a game.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Like I remember when I was doing robotics as well, I learned about something called Q learning, which is like reinforcement training with machine learning. Yeah, I
Right.
think that definitely relates. And also, I had like a quick follow-up. Is this type of research done in like wet lab scenarios, like you're talking about like all the soldering circuits, or is this more like on your actual computer writing code and writing algorithms?
Okay. For the ASDRP stuff, it's mostly writing algorithms or taking an algorithm and modifying it to meet a particular situation. You will, okay, there will be some machine part building, like for the autonomous vehicle tests. We have some people testing autonomous cars, and we have people testing autonomous boats. And so what you have to do in that situation is some amount of time has to be spent constructing the boat or the car with all the things that you need. You're going to need a processor. Usually that winds up being a Raspberry Pi. You're going to need a camera. You may need some kind of pressure sensing thing if you're going to see how hard you're hitting something. You may need to actually have, so you're going to need servos and motor controls to make the car turn and roll in the direction that you want to go. And typically all of those things are not built in to a robot, off the shelf. So you have to buy a bunch of parts, probably a half a dozen parts, and put them all together and then write code on the Pi that will control those parts.
Yeah, that definitely
All right.
makes sense.
That's really interesting. One thing I actually had a question about a little bit earlier before, we were on this current topic is you were talking about how like you would combine different topics in your work, like game theory and machine learning, as well as like other topics. So I had a question like regarding your whole quantum physics experience. When you were switching over from quantum physics to CS, did you like see yourself like using multiple topics maybe in quantum physics in your CS work, like just like overlapping in any sort of way?
Okay. Only here at ASDRP. One of my first quantum physics groups, there is something called quantum entanglement, which says that two particles, either separated in space or separated in time, can know something about each other. Separated in space is called spatial entanglement. Separated in time and still knowing about each other is called temporal entanglement. And there have been some experiments done in the research world that demonstrate both of these phenomena actually existing. So my kids wanted to know if there was a connection between temporal entanglement and spatial entanglement. And most of the work that was done in spatial entanglement was done as lab work, and most of the work that was done in temporal entanglement was done as computer simulations. And they wanted to compare and see if there was any connection between the two of those. And we actually got a paper accepted for publication based on what they were able to do in terms of trying to relate the two. And they came up with some methodologies for examining the two phenomena and trying to find a correlation between them. And they were able to find some associations, but they were not able to prove them. But what they were able to find was enough commonality to make it worth a publishable paper. It was taking other people's physical work, other people's computer work, adding some computer work to that to correlate the two, and then seeing what results you come out with.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I can see like in the future how things would overlap, especially like all the new technology coming out. So we actually had a pre-submitted question. So somebody like we had like your profile or your personal website link, and in it had a couple of like patents, like hardware and firmware device patents. So someone was curious, like how exactly do you obtain a patent, and like what exactly went on with this, the multiple patents that you have?
Okay, this is very interesting. My first patent wound up being a surprise to me because I was working with a hardware group on some networking, and we were trying to solve a problem of designing our network to work with our machines. We wanted to use a network that was a common network that was being touted as an industry standard. But we found some real performance problems. It would run slow in certain instances. So we added some capabilities to it. There were about 4 of us that just got together and we put our heads together and we said, what can we do? And so we made some changes to allow what was called, we allowed request response transactions on the network to be separated so that you could make a request on the network and then drop the network, and then the response would come back later. In the previous networking designs, you would make a request on the network and you would hang on to it until you got the response back. So if your responder was slow in responding, nobody else could use the network for the time between the time you made the request and the response came back. So we made some changes that allowed higher utilization of the network. And one of the guys who was working on it called me up and said, hey, we're writing a patent about this, and you're going to be included in this patent. Would you like to write it? And I'd never written a patent before. And I said, huh, me? Patent? What? So he wound up writing he was going to give me the lead authorship on the patent if I was willing to write it. But I was not ready to write it at that time. But we got that patent through, and I saw that it was actually a fairly straightforward process. It takes a long time. It takes about 5 years for your patent, once you submit it, to get approved because of all of the process that it has to go through to verify it. So the next time it came time to write a patent, I had an idea with some firmware people on another thing. I would have to actually look at my patents and see what order I got them in. I was willing to take the lead writing that one. And so, and then, okay, so that was networking. The other thing that we were doing as a company, when we had invented our new processor, we wanted to build a large multi-scale computing system with many processors in it. We're talking 64, 128, 256 processors, so that it would run bigger and faster. Okay, the problem when you have that many processors is to be able to coordinate their work so that they're not fighting against each other, but they're working together. Also to control their access to memory and stuff like that. So we had to build some more ASICs. An ASIC is a hardware device, a chip that's not a processor chip, but that is used with a processor chip. Network bridges are ASICs. We built something called crossbars, which would connect a processor, memory, and a networking. And we'd already built networking chips. So we had networking chips, crossbars, processors, and memory controllers. And so I worked in a group that put those parts together. And I think we got 3 or 4 patents out of the connections that we had to do, adding multiple processors together into one machine with all of the other ASICs that we had to invent and connect together. So that's that kind of gives you an idea of some of the other patents that we've done. My most recent patents were in the area of security. I worked with a group called the Trusted Computing Group. And so probably not, I would say that the patents I got interested in security were not the most important thing, but I wrote a document on how to write a trusted server. And we had other people working on documents for writing trusted PCs, trusted clients, trusted disk drives and stuff like that. So that, you talk about, you hear about computers being hacked and memories being hacked and data being stolen. Well, we wanted to make our things trusted so that it could protect the data that was in it, and it could convince whoever was asking for the data that if it gave it to them, that would be the good data, that it would be trustable data. So the thing works 2 ways. Security works 2 ways. It's not just, can I keep the bad guy's hands off of what I've got? It is, can I convince somebody who has the data that I'm a trusted partner and they should give the data to me? And so that was something, some patents in the area of security that I wrote. So that pretty much goes through the litany of patents.
All right, so hopefully everyone in the call wrote all that stuff down because it seemed really insightful on how patents work. We actually have a few questions rolling in the chat right now, so I can go ahead and read those out loud for
Okay,
you.
I can see those.
Yeah, so
okay.
yeah, so one person asked, how does a quantum computer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this person says, how does a quantum computing help in machine learning? So I guess you could answer that one if you wanted to.
Okay, okay. There's a couple of things that it does, actually. Quantum computing, okay, let's go back to classical computing so that we can see what difference quantum computing makes. Classical computing is based on bits, 0 or 1. Quantum states are multiple states, and scientists have figured out a way to use those multiple states to compute multiple problems in parallel at the same time. So quantum computing is only marginally faster, but it's much more parallel. So you can solve many more problems at the same time. Machine learning is often an issue of finding out how to optimize a problem, what works well and what didn't work well, and sifting out the items that you don't want to allow what you're trying to do to come through. So that means that machine learning is very dependent on being able to parallelize a problem. And that's how quantum computing does it, because it allows massive parallelization. Now, I will say this, we are in the infancy of quantum computing now. Quantum computing structures can only be built to a certain size at this point. In order to make quantum computing necessary for what we call supercomputing, we're going to have to expand its capabilities, many more states than we are capable of supporting now. And so that's where quantum computing has to go in order to fulfill its promise.
Yeah, so speaking of like the advancements of quantum computing, someone also had another question in the chat, like what are the current advancements right now in quantum computing space? And what do you think of them, if you've been following them?
Okay. The primary advancements are the efforts to parallelize computing on a massive scale, so that you're not just doing, in our current processors, we have processors to where you can run 4 problems at the same time on the same processor. We need to get to the point with quantum computing to where you can run hundreds of things in parallel at the same time on the processor.
I got you. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So
that's
probably,
what
how long do you think it'll? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
How long do I think it'll take? Outside a couple of decades, maybe less. It will be the thing, maybe when you're in the middle of your career, it may be the thing that is reaching its maturity. You might be the guy who puts the final touch on it.
Yeah, you never know. Okay, I think this has been extremely insightful so far. And as we're like wrapping up on our time, I think like the last general question that both me and Rishit, and I think everyone here kind of has, like, do you have any final words of advice or anything that you'd suggest to all the students here today to advance their careers, or just any like words of wisdom that you've learned from your experience so far?
I think the first thing you want to do is to make sure you have a strong basis in math and science. I would say you need to make sure that you have taken calculus, and this is at the high school level. Once you get into college, you're going to have to do all sorts of interesting math courses. In addition, I think you should have a strong background in science. I don't think that AP Physics 1 is enough, because it's primarily mechanics. You need some kind of study in electricity and magnetism also. If you understand electricity and magnetism, and if you understand the math, the other thing is, if you should take enough quantum physics to understand the Schrodinger's equation, the uncertainty principle, and stuff like that. If you've got a good grounding in all of those things, then it will be very easy to do some advanced work in the scientific or mathematical field.
So definitely a lot of focus on STEM, I can see, like getting your foundation solid. And then the rest, I'm assuming, works itself out in the future if you have a solid foundation.
Let me add something on the humanities side, or what we would call the humanities side. You need to learn how to manage people in an understated way. Shouting at people does not get results. But if you can be clear about what you want, if you can, so there might be, I will tell you that if you go take a management course and you go do therapy, management courses and therapy look a lot alike. They're all about how to treat people so that you get a good response from them. So I'm not saying everybody has to run out and jump into therapy right now, but you have to learn how to pick up some stuff like that so that you can communicate effectively with people. More important than the actual knowledge itself, STEM is important, but more important than that is the ability to communicate and to be able to say what you are trying to say to someone so that they understand it, and to be able to pick up what they're saying so that you understand them. Communication on top, STEM next.
I definitely agree. There's a lot of things that go into it. And I guess the last question we have today, since we have to wrap it up, the recording soon. Someone asked, as a going in senior in high school, what should I expect from AP Physics 2?
Okay, I have never taught AP Physics 2 because it's not offered at Fremont STEM, and I've done AP Physics 1 and AP Physics C. AP Physics C has a little bit of the stuff that's, I think, in AP Physics 2. I would have to read a AP Physics 2 syllabus in order to answer that question adequately.
But I think as long as you're getting into this sort of stuff, you're getting the basics down. And that was your main piece of advice.
Right.
So I think that about wraps it up for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Larry McMahan. I think we all appreciated and learned a lot today, especially from all the interesting experiences you brought up. And that about wraps it up, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you for watching from YouTube as well. And we hope to see you all at our next Infinite STEM event. But a big shout out to Dr. Larry McMahan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks. I hope it helped.